Welcome back, Deep Your VTV viewers. It is Chris Nichols here, and we're coming to you from inside the house today because first off, it's gross outside, but also we're playing with the Canon EOS R3 and really focusing on more controlled testing today. Things like low light performance and dynamic range. And we want to just see how this camera is performing for the test that we weren't able to evaluate when we did our pre-production video. And if you haven't checked out that video already, definitely do, because that covers the overview of the camera. We're not talking about that today. As well, Jordan's been shooting on a Canon EOS R3 for quite a few episodes. He's done a lot of extra testing and it's shooting me right now, so he'll be on as well to talk about video. Now, I do think it's important to keep in mind a couple things here. First off, this is Canon's first attempt at a full-frame stacked CMOS chip, so we really want to see how it's improved over their older sensors. And also keep in mind the EOS R3 is intended to be a lower megapixel, high-speed action sports wildlife kind of camera. Having a stacked CMOS chip does give us some benefits when we want to shoot electronic shutter mode only, and there's a lot of reasons you might want to do that. Now, first off, this camera has minimal rolling shutter. We've already tested that. That's nice. And so having electronic shutter means you can be silent when you need to. It also means you can get faster burst rates if you're shooting wildlife and sports. And if you want maximum stability, you don't get any shutter shock. That can be really nice if you're shooting on a tripod, studio, and landscape situations. We are going to test some strobe work as well later on, but primarily what we're going to talk about right now is what about image quality, because sometimes shooting electronic shutter does have a loss of dynamic range compared to shooting mechanical shutter. Let's take a look at that. So first off, looking at our ISO performance at 12,800, whether shooting electronic or mechanical, honestly, we couldn't see any real difference at all. Nothing appreciable. But when we look at dynamic range shooting mechanical and electronic, we push both files heavily, you can see here that we do get slightly more dynamic range with the mechanical shutter. So that benefit does seem to hold true. However, it is very minor here. You can see it's a very minimal difference. And so honestly, I'd have no problem shooting electronic shutter mode and still being happy with the dynamic range I'm getting on the Canon EOS R3. Okay, so next we want to take a look at high ISO performance with the Canon EOS R3. Now we decided to do our test at ISO 12,800 because it is a very high value, but it's also still something you might practically use in a low light situation. So the first sensor that we want to compare it against is the Canon EOS R6. That has a 20 megapixel non-backside illuminated sensor. And looking at the results here, when you look at the two files, I'd actually give a slight edge to the Canon EOS R6, but they're very similar. We also wanted to test against a backside illuminated sensor. Now we have a Panasonic S5. It's got a 24 megapixel BSI sensor. And again, looking at the two files here, again, I'd say very similar, but I'd actually give a slight edge to the Panasonic S5 over the Canon EOS R3. We have one more test though. The staff at Deep Your View tested this sensor against a Sony A9 Mark II. Now that has a stacked CMOS chip, very similar to what we find in the Canon EOS R3. And in that regard, actually, I'd say the edge goes to the Canon EOS R3. Just slightly again though. And I think the main takeaway is, although there's slight variations here, regardless, when testing against cameras in a similar class, they seem to get basically the same high ISO performance. So next we wanted to test dynamic range. So we took both the EOS R3 and the EOS R6. We shot them with the same controlled lighting situation, exact same lens, same shutter speed, aperture, and ISO settings. And then we pushed both files 5 stops. We also shot both of these with the mechanical shutter option. And so looking at the two files when pushed, honestly, it's pretty similar. I'm not seeing a really big difference in the level of noise from both files. So what I will say is this. The EOS R3 definitely has an advantage when it comes to detail. The EOS R6 is definitely softer when you look at them up close, and that is a benefit there. But if you're looking for real improvement in dynamic range and even low light performance, that's not really the reason to buy the EOS R3. It's really going to come down to more so that it's a faster reading stacked CMOS sensor with the benefits that those provide. Oh, what are you looking at? Have you been there the whole time?
I've been waiting to talk.
Why are you wearing a winter coat? We're indoors. It's so weird.
Okay, full disclosure, I forgot I was going to be on camera today and threw on my Lumix shirt, which is not appropriate when doing a Canon review. So we're just going to keep this on so I can keep my unbiased aesthetics.
Okay, well, I guess we're going to talk about video next with Jordan. He didn't get a lot of time to talk about it in our first review in Seattle. So Jordan in a winter coat, everybody. So strange.
Now, the biggest thing I really wanted to test after using the pre-production camera was overheating with some of the more demanding video modes, because this can do internal raw video, 4K 120, And when we were shooting with the pre-production camera, after Chris had been shooting for about an hour, I shot a few 4K 120 clips and saw the overheat warning on the camera. Now, what I wanted to do is test it in a little more controlled environment. So at room temperature, we put it in auto temperature off high, so the camera's not going to shut off even if it does get a little bit warm, and ran some controlled tests. And doing 4K 60, which is an oversampled video mode, I was able to record for over 90 minutes before I said, you know what, I'm not really concerned about this. We're not even seeing an overheat warning. When we switched over to RAW, similarly at 45 minutes, I was tired of formatting the card, and I don't think people will be recording continuous 45-minute RAW clips. We again didn't have a temperature warning there. The only time I did have an actual overheat was in the 4K 120 mode. There, I got an overheat warning at about 8.5 minutes, and just after 11 minutes, the camera did shut down, and camera body was quite warm, but the card was scorching hot when I took it out there. But remember, that's nearly an hour of playback in that 11-minute slow motion clip, so it's not often you're going to be recording continuous clips this way. Overheating is way less of a problem on the R3 than it was on the R5 or the R6. In terms of the actual video quality that comes out of the R3, I was very impressed. As I mentioned, it's oversampled video in 4K going up to 60 frames per second, and if you need tons of flexibility in post, this lets you record raw video internally, and it uses Canon's RAW light format, which gives you much smaller file sizes than their Canon RAW recording format. The one time you will see a drop in quality is when you jump up to 4K 120. There, it's no longer oversampling the video, and you are going to see a reduction in image quality and a little bit more noise. But in general, this is some of the nicest image quality we've seen out of the Canon, and again, the overheating's not a real problem. Speaking of overheating, can we turn on like the air conditioning?
It's November.
This is much better. And you can say what you want about Chris and I, but we are definitely problem solvers. And there are some problems with the Canon R3. And I did find that using the tap to track autofocus quite frequently, even without a fast moving subject, it would lose the subject I was trying to focus on and wander off to the background. It's not as sticky as it is when you're using the camera for photography. As well, it still has some of the Canon quirks where we've got this incredibly powerful camera that can shoot 30 frames per second and do internal raw video, and it can't display a level gauge while I'm rolling video or my histogram while I'm shooting. And this is something that's been irritating me for quite a while with Canon cameras, and I'd love to see it fixed. We need our assist tools when we're recording the video as well as before we start. So yeah, there are some limitations with the R3, but this is, I would say, definitely the most flexible video tool in Canon's entire mirrorless lineup. Like, yes, if you need more resolution, then the R5 is going to give you that. But remember, that camera has a much slower readout. You're going to have more rolling shutter in the video. The Canon R3 has that big battery that works wonderfully. It has the multi-interface shoe, so you're going to have more audio connection options. I just think the R3 is a more flexible all-around tool and Canon's best mirrorless camera for video recording, but there's other flagship cameras out there. We've got the A1, and I was really impressed with the Nikon Z9 for video recording, so you're going to want to subscribe because I'm going to shoot all of those out for video as well in an upcoming episode. But for now, back to Chris to talk about strobes. It's like a constant light, but it just flashes for a second. I don't totally understand it.
Okay, so as you can see, we're outside. We wanted to get out of the house. You know, the weather's calmed down a bit. The wind's only gusting to 60 or 70 kilometers an hour now, but we're braving it for you because we just wanted to do some autofocusing tests, a little bit of a change of scenery, but it is damn cold. Now let's talk about eye control first, because of course that is still the main change to autofocus on this camera. We did play with the camera quite extensively in Seattle, but we didn't get a lot of people trying the different eye control. So this is a good opportunity to have a production camera and really test it out. I haven't found any changes. For me, the eye control works very effectively. Easy to calibrate, tracks my eye well. I find it very intuitive to choose my initial focusing point. But Jordan's now actually had quite a bit of time on the R3 to play with it and test it himself, and he's having difficulty still getting the eye control to follow his eye. It often drifts after he sets an initial point, and you know, again, his wife's tried it as well. She can't even get it to get past the calibration stage. It just doesn't work properly. So we're still finding the camera has difficulties with different people's eyes. eyes, and it's really going to come down to trial and error. Now, on that same note, remember that eye control is really just about setting my initial tracking point, right? I find it very intuitive, but there's many ways that you can do that. So if eye control doesn't work, Jordan really likes the multifunction controller on the back. Slide his thumb over and choose his point that way. You can use the traditional autofocusing joystick, that works as well, or just go to choosing a zone or point and then moving the camera, locking your initial point and recomposing. So regardless, you've got lots of ways to get the tracking to work properly. And let's talk about that next. I did a test here, Jordan running around a tree. I have to make sure that I set the camera to be very sticky on Jordan, ignoring any subjects that come in between us. I really want it to lock on him. As well, I chose the autofocus casing that ignores objects that may come into view, blocking your subject. And then in that regard, it did a fantastic job. Follows Jordan, doesn't get confused by the tree, and tracks his eyes from far all the way to close to the camera. So I had really good success that way. Like every camera, we did still have some issues. I mean, Jordan took the camera for the weekend, and even shooting in good light, sometimes it would miss focus just behind or in front of the eye. Animal detection, sometimes it wouldn't quite work, even though normally it is an excellent system. I think the thing to take away with the Canon EOS R3 is you absolutely have to use the right subject detection for the right situation, and you have to be willing to set up your autofocus properly for the scenarios. And if you're just looking for one mode that you can set and then forget and works in most situations, you might be disappointed. But if you're a dedicated journalist, wildlife photographer, sports photographer, and you're willing to do the autofocusing work, you'll find this behaves exactly like you want it to. Now, one thing we didn't really get to test on the pre-production cameras in Seattle was how it would work with strobes and how it would handle flicker under artificial lighting. So once we got a final camera, that's definitely something we tested. Now, first off, Canon says that the R3's maximum mechanical flash sync shutter speed is 200th of a second. And indeed it is. I mean, I tested it with my old school flashes, just, PC sync, port studio flash, and it did a good job. But I do want to mention that 200th of a second mechanical isn't that fast. The Sony A1, for example, doubles that performance. So that's a little bit disappointing. Now, what about electronic shutter though? Well, we're getting 180th of a second maximum flash sync for electronic shutter. That's not bad. But again, let's keep in mind that the Sony A1 and Z9 are just a little bit faster there at 200th of a second. Regardless, I tested that and I was getting no problems at 180th. I did try pushing to 200th just to see what happened. I'm getting a slight sliver of blackout on the side of the frame. Now, we did touch on flicker reduction with the Canon EOS R3 pre-production camera. I mean, if you're in mechanical shutter mode, you can use their flicker reduction setting, and it's always worked well on older cameras. It works fine here. What I really wanted to play with back home was the HF flicker reduction system, which is for electronic shutter mode. Now, this is a really cool setup. Now, a lot of cameras on the market let you fine-tune your shutter speed to try to avoid flicker and banding when you're shooting electronic shutter, but what the Canon does is automatically scans for it and then sets the appropriate shutter speed for that particular lighting setup. It's convenient, it just saves you a little bit of trouble, and it knows that you can then shoot photos and most importantly also video, knowing that you're not going to get that flicker. So really nice feature and easy to use. So the goal of today's video is really to just fully test some of the things that we weren't able to cover with the pre-production camera. I'm happy to report that yes, the things that we were concerned about weren't concerns. Everything's solid, but I also think it's important, for better or for worse, whatever Canon intended, this is going to get compared against the Nikon Z9 and the Sony A1, and I can't help but feel that this is definitely, from now testing it, much more of a niche camera than those other two. It's very fast and very capable. I mean, no camera can shoot high quality RAWs at 30 frames per second like this camera can. It's got a great buffer, and I like the autofocus performance on it. But you are getting lower resolution, and the camera is very expensive for what you're paying for. I love the smaller body design. I think it's very intuitive to use, and I definitely get this over a 1DX3 if I was looking to start in a wildlife journalistic kind of camera in the Canon platform. But otherwise, I think the Z9, the A1, you're getting a lot more resolution, you're getting other features that are very interesting. And so what we really want to do then is shoot a video where we test the R3 versus the Z9 versus the Sony A1. So please subscribe to the channel and keep an eye out for that. So leave your comments below. Let us know what you think about the EOS R3 and how it stacks up against the competition. But as always, thank you guys so much for joining. We shall see you soon with another episode of Deep Review TV.